to start again with the recommendation and the presentation. Stefan Schurig, the Secretary General of F20, again with us. Stefan.
Your podium.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much, Connie. Yes, just to put things a bit into perspective, the nature of the recommendations that we've developed with the F20 Steering Committee, which is a group of more than 10 foundations joining F20, this year have been launched already in the context of the G20. The reason for that is because we increasingly should consider the G7, the group of the G7 countries, a subgroup of the G20. So not just the rich countries club, but really a subgroup or a subset of the G20. And this already was important to mention in this context, which is why we highlighted. But also want to briefly give justice to two other endeavors that we as F20 could help getting off the ground. One was a joint letter by executives from community foundations to the G20. And we just before lunch, we discussed how important it is to consider the cities and communities as the landing place for multilateral decisions. And therefore, this was exactly the context of the joint letter to the heads of governments of the G20, basically saying, well, thinking globally and acting locally really needs to find its translation in their policy making with regard to what ends up at these landing places in the cities. A second endeavor we went on to was a joint call by some 15 foundations from Italy and the UK upon the two heads of government of the UK and of Italy, asking them to really make the connection between the G20 summit taking place in Italy and the COP26, this hugely important UN climate summit you have heard of many times here in the last 2 days. So these two things were already happening. We are at the moment also helping to get together a joint statement by the different engagement groups that already covers some of the content, of course, of the engagement group C20, and also then lists some of the recommendations from Foundations 20. I just want to highlight the 6 circuits here around the key target, which is really remaining under this 1.5 degrees temperature increase. This is the overall goal. It's a list of more than 40 policy-tailored recommendations that we've developed in the steering group. Don't be scared. I'm not going through this 40 points now. I'm just taking you through this summary of points that we issued to the G7 and that are now been sort of reconfirmed in our discussion here in the last 2 days. The first point is obviously addressing the current situation in many, many countries around the world with this global vulnerability experience of a pandemic. So the most important subject on the beginning was really ensuring a healthy and equitable green recovery. And that is sort of put on top of the list of recommendations, but it also then comes up with some concrete suggestions that then addresses the availability of funding, especially for those countries who can't really afford measures that we've heard being taken up in the European Union, for example, or so. That's the first point. The second point is a clear commitment to net zero emissions by the year 2050 and aligned with the 1.5 degrees target or benchmark. I always consider the 1.5 degrees not really a target, because the target is to not reach it. So it's a benchmark, it's a limit. And here we are asking for very concrete interim steps from the G20 countries, how to get there. As you know, and just reminding ourselves again, the G20 countries, of course, have to take care for their own constituencies within the G20 countries, but many of these countries run large infrastructure programs that are covering 50, 60 countries in the world. And of course, we want that the policy of the G20 countries has been translated into these infrastructure programs as well. The third point is on this hugely important goal to not just talk about a transition, but to make it just and affordable and green, and led by the UN formula of leaving no one behind. So we are listing a few key points that policymakers are actually looking for when they read these kind of documents, making this point of the just transition. The fourth point is on the nexus that we started our discussion here yesterday with, on the interdependencies between protecting our forests, protecting our oceans, transition the energy sector, going towards renewable energy, the linkages between climate, energy, and biodiversity. And we address this also with regard to not just the G7, but again with the G20 agenda to really address these subjects, not just with regard to concrete policy recommendations, but also with regard to the different institutions. While we are speaking, China is ramping up to have the CBD conference, the conference on biodiversity, the so-called COP15, and it is important that the G20 consider these events as important and are mentioned in their frameworks. The last 2 points, one is on the question of financial capacity in the different countries, and the financial capacity of different countries clearly is also slowed down when you are in deep depth. So how can you recover when you have to finance debts and when you actually can't breathe as a country? So we're asking, as many others also do, asking for a debt relief and a debt moratorium where it is necessary, and we ask the G20 here also to form a group of front runners. If it's not the entire group that would agree to that, then we're asking for a group of front runners. And the last point was one point that was also raised by Michael Northrup yesterday, for example, and which was also raised by John Kerry, is really the finance sector and how can we help to decarbonize the finance sector. And there's a proposal that you hardly, well, that is something that bears mentioning at least, is that we are asking for making decarbonization plans mandatory for financial companies. This, of course, then needs a lot of further scrutiny on how you do this, how you measure, how you report, how you guarantee transparency. And we know that there are different mechanisms discussed in the COP context, but also in the G20. But decarbonizing finance is really absolute key so that we are not still investing the 700 billion euros that are still being lended by banks to fossil fuels that we heard yesterday, that figure. So I closed here just to give you an example, but that's sort of the overview of the list of recommendations. Feel free to download them. And again, this is, don't be shocked by the long list of by the long list of recommendations. It is actually a result of a broad discussion in our steering group. And I leave it there and I hand back to you, Connie and Andrea.
Well, thank you so much, Stefan. I think this is a very impressive image that wrap up all the main ideas that we discussed so far. So thank you also for your introduction and the recommendation of the F20.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And ladies and gentlemen, just let me give you a quick reminder why we are actually talking about those 1.5 degrees, the big blob in the middle that everything and the recommendations are all about, that all the talks are about. Yesterday we heard Johan Rockström saying this is the last year, 2021, so we don't have much time anymore, that we can actually put the things right to get to 1.5. Why is 1.5 decisive? Well, we all need to get together, listen to the science, and the science says, Chatham House analysts say that right at the moment, with the present trajectory set of all the recommendations and of all the things that all states have promised, we are only at a 5% chance of keeping below 2 degrees, and we're only of a 1% chance right at the moment, if all the indices that are promised are going to be fulfilled and lived, of actually achieving 1.5. So there is a lot of room for action, and sorry to sort of, wave the red flag. It is not just about the detail, it is about being aware why we all do that, why we've been here together. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got this fantastic lineup of all foundations that are chipping in for 7 keynotes, and we're actually going to start with one very decisive factor, because without the hosting of the Environmental Foundation, Michael Otto, the F20 Foundation wouldn't have a house to work from, and that, of course, is in Hamburg. The Environmental Foundation, Michael Otto, has a number of foundations, both under its wings and fellow foundations, that are heavily invested in climate action and also, of course, sustainability in driving the issue and conversation with the public, but also, and that's quite important, with business. And that foundation is called 2 Degree.